Hello, and welcome to the Lore of Braunhaven. On today's episode, we are going to be talking about the Imperial Port, and this segment of our uh, series is going to go over many episodes because the Imperial Port, there's a lot to it, and it will go into the surrounding environments of the Imperial Port as well, such as Smuggler's Cove and Reef's End, and some of the events that shape the area in that region. So the Imperial Port can't really be talked about without bringing in Tasadantilis' towers. So in negative 653, Maximilian Tasadantilis, after having been adventuring across the known world and essentially creating legends about himself, not that he necessarily created them, but the stories that people tell of his exploits during that time. Some of them have a kernel of truth in them, and then others are mere fabrications as to the fantastic things that Maximilian Tacidantilus got up to. But in negative 653, he returned to the mouth of the Great River, where it opens up into the Dragon Sea, and he decided to construct his tower. And there are stories that say that he was able to construct the tower in 2 days, and there are others who are a little more conservative and say, "Oh, well, it took him 2 weeks." Either way, the stories that are told about the construction of the tower are pretty fantastic. But build it, he did. And he built this magnificent tower that held inside many secrets. You have been able to go into the tower and come out to tell of those secrets. The few that have speak of shifting architecture and illusions and other worlds on sitting on an entire level and things of that nature. he wasn't he wasn't quite satisfied with just creating the tower, though. Being forever the forward thinker and knowing what the young emperor at the time was trying to do in kind of consolidating this vast region that would become the Glaucian Empire, Tacidantilus knew that if that dream were to actually unfold and come true, the people of the Glaucian Empire weren't going to really be much of anything unless they made their mark and set themselves on the world stage. And so in negative 600, Tacidantilus convinced the emperor at the time to begin construction on the Imperial Port. His idea was that you have to have global scale trade in order for you to truly be called an empire. And the only reason the Glaucian Empire is considered an empire in air quotes is because before it was mostly made up of petty lords that you couldn't even really consider them kingdoms, maybe small baronies, but the Glaucian Empire was consolidated under the emperor at that point. And so at negative 600, they began construction on the Imperial Port. And it is said that the Imperial Port, at the time of its construction with its docks, was able to dock 15 galleons at one time. That number might seem low, but a galleon is a really big ship. So it was considerable for a fledgling port. The Imperial Port, this is a map of the Imperial Port as it would be seen in the current age today. You'll note that there are a couple of small farmsteads, and then there is, of course, the edge of the Sylvanus Forest to the southeast. The Imperial Port has stood for nearly 600 years. And initially, it only consisted of what is now known as the Merchant District, and it spans across the Great River. Trade ships can actually come down the Great River and go directly under many of these buildings. And there are a number of bridges, and the buildings are connected with wooden walkways or sometimes stone walkways. And a lot of uh, the lower parts of these buildings actually have private docks in and of themselves that merchants can dock their ships directly to. And the construction began in negative 600, and it was basically open for business by negative 598. Of course, there again, thanks to the assistance of Tasadantilis and his sorcerous ways, using you know various elemental magics and things of that nature in order to help construct this port. The Empire made sure to send out trade vessels of their own by as early as negative 597. And these vessels, yes, they offered trade, but their purpose wasn't so much to make money at that point as it was to spread the word that the Glaucian Empire now had the Imperial Port, and that you should come here and do business. It took almost no time whatsoever for the nations of Arentus, far to the east across the Dragon City, or across the Dragon Sea, and for the nation of Erebatia, which is far to the southeast, to take note of this. And knowing that this was a new fledgling empire, those two countries kind of saw the writing on the wall and decided to voraciously trade. And the reasoning for that, of course, is that because the Glaucian Empire was new and young, the thought process for those two nations was that they could fleece them. Quite literally, they would be able to just take them for everything they're worth and get more out of it than the value of the goods that they were trading. And so by negative 590, the merchant district, what is now the merchant district, the center portion, had ballooned into a rather large city, and the Imperial Port was considered at that time to be the second largest city in the entire Glaucian Empire. You know, of course, Glauchine, the capital, being considered the largest city. From the Glaucian Empire, or excuse me, from the Imperial Port, heading up the Imperial Tradeway, you would see merchant caravans, and this was really the heyday of the Imperial Tradeway. The merchant caravans would go up and down the Imperial Tradeway. Sometimes, hanging a left at the at the crossroads with the Eastern Tradeway, and heading up into the mountains to do trade with Zlatoheim and possibly even Olasveller in Stagina. But many of them made their way either up the Imperial Tradeway, or in some cases made their way. They had galleons that would not galleons. They had barges and ships that would make their way up the Great River and conduct trade all the way up into Glauchine. And Glauchine had ports, of course, on the Frostholm Sea. They weren't anywhere nearly as vast, and so some of that trade, they had some minor trade with Olasveller, but it was by this point the Glaucian Empire conducting trade with Olasveller was really more of a private concern for individual merchants, because the Glaucian Empire and Stagina were frequently at odds with one another because of all of the raiding clans that would come out of Stagina. So there wasn't an official trade policy really with Stagina. It was mostly private industry that was conducting trade, and the ports on the northern end on the Frostholm Sea were mostly of a military nature. And even then, they were very slight. The Glaucian Empire was never particularly good at navigating the Frostholm Sea. That was really where the Staginians really shined, because they're born with the seafarer secondary skill. They learn how to row a boat and sail a ship at birth, and so the Glaucian Empire just didn't do well in the Frosthelm Sea. So you have trade moving up and down the imperial tradeway. You've got the the merchant district has ballooned, and you've got trade coming in and out of the port. Uh, by negative 550, the merchants of the imperial port had grown tired of living in their little apartments above their warehouses or their markets, and they really wanted to stretch their legs, and let's call it what it is. They wanted to show off their wealth, and so by negative 550, they had begun construction on two sections. The first section was the docks district to the south of the merchant district, and this would become where their warehouses would be, and it catered specifically to the sailors that were coming in or going out from the port. And the docks district, I mean, because it catered to the sailors, it was really known to be the red light and vice district. There was prostitution, gambling, uh, occasionally drugs. It was a fairly lawless region. And if you were spending time in the docks district, it was well known that murder was not, you know, an abnormal occurrence. If you stepped out of a seedy tavern, and I mean it's the docks district, so they're all seedy, right? And you were drunk and stumbling down an alley, 9 times out of 10, you might trip over a dead body of somebody that was off for one reason or another. To the north of the merchant district, they began construction on the walled high district. And this was going to be where these wealthy merchants lived. They might be conducting business in the merchant district, but the high district was where they lived. And so it was walled off to keep out the riffraff. They spent no, or they spared no expense in hiring veterans and mercenaries to essentially man the wall and to guard the gates. And the entire area is made up of manor houses, uh, brick-faced tenement houses. Well, not tenement houses, but high-end apartment living. And the off center of the high district, they created a grand park, and there's actually a man-made lake in the middle of this park, and it is surrounded by woodlands, trees, and it almost like Central Park in New York. But this was strictly the domain of the rich and wealthy and powerful of the imperial port, and so they kind of sequestered themselves away from everything else and from their lowly workers. By negative 250, the not just the Glaucian Empire, but also Orentis and Erebachia had discovered uh, the continent of Tlaxuetl, and Tlaxuetl was essentially a veritable gold rush. Literally, I mean, they were pulling gold and platinum out of there, jade and other precious gems, and also because of the somewhat primitive nature of many of the people there, and I use the term primitive fairly loosely. Um, but their initial contacts with a lot of the people that lived there, uh, there was a large amount of slaves coming out of Tlaxcahuitl, and they were being brought back uh, to the imperial port. Now, at that time, it was not a case of slavery being something that was officially sanctioned by the Glaucian Empire, and certainly not in Orentis. Orentis really has a kind of an not an anti-slavery stance, but They just don't do it. If you do it, they don't care. But Arentus doesn't really do the whole slave thing. Um, but Arabashia does. Arabashia has a huge economy based on slavery, and in Arabashia, you're even in the current age, you're probably looking at one in every five people that you meet on the street is probably a slave of some kind. And they handle it a little bit differently. Like slaves do have rights. Slaves can vote if there is a vote that has to go on. They can bring um, grievances to the town councils or to the I was going to say federal, but that's maybe that's not the right term, to the royal court. Um, and so it's handled a little bit differently, but there is slavery, and but the Galatian Empire didn't really have a solid political stance or a mandate for slavery. Instead, this was strictly done by the more slimy individuals of the merchants guilds and the merchants district, and so you had a ton of these slaves coming in and being sold and traded, and this essentially made the Thieves Guild of the Imperial Port vastly wealthy. And because of their wealth, they of course gained power. And when they started to, similarly to the Merchants Guild, started to want to flaunt their wealth, and they got a big head. And they're like, well, there's really nothing that anybody can do to stop us, so we'll start moving our prostitution and racketeering into the actual merchant district. And this put them at direct odds with the Merchants Guild, and a citywide gang war between the Merchants Guild and the Thieves Guild broke out in -200. And this went on for quite some time, and finally ended with a major event, battle between gangs of the Merchants and the Thieves Guild, uh, leading up to a number of warehouses in the Merchants Guild being burned. Uh, there was a large fire, and this actually it kind of got out of control, and so both the Merchants Guild and the Thieves Guild realized that we can't keep doing this, because putting it at odds with one another, we're both going to lose money. And so they had a meeting of the minds, and a truce was agreed to between the two guilds. That essentially the way the truce worked out is that the Thieves Guild was going to be allowed to operate in other districts, but more overt criminal acts such as prostitution and gambling or drug running would only be relegated to the docks district in the south. That kind of stuff is not going to fly in the merchant district. But the agreement was that the Thieves Guild would be able to operate in the merchant district and even the high district. And so you've got these guilds that are now kind of in an agreement with one another, and things kind of settled out. In -180, Maximilian Tasadantilis once again returned to the Imperial Port and to his tower. And this time he had been traveling the world, and kind of saw how things were done in Arabashia. He saw how things were done in Arentus, and so he came back to his tower, and he decided that he was going to build the library vestibule to his tower. Now, this actually turned into much more than he initially had planned, and so this grand vestibule library blew up. There were texts and books from all over the world getting flooded in. The library just got bigger and bigger and bigger. And later they actually added on the northern wing and kind of extended this out. And so the library was known to have books on every kind of magic, both arcane and divine, and and it just ballooned. And with that, you saw the the early construction of the university district. And so, with the knowledge being supplied at the library, you had many scholars coming from all across the world to build small colleges and universities specifically for individual topics. And you had students from all over the world coming to the university district at the Imperial Port to learn from these people. And so, I mean, there was a Bard's College. There is numerous colleges on the different ecclesiastical teachings of the gods, both the known gods and studies of the old gods. There is, arcane schools for illusionists and necromancers, and all manner of things. So the university district really ballooned up, and so they did have that scholar class that had moved in. And they pretty much stuck to the university district. Aside from the colleges, the university district also had a lot of smaller houses, manors that were built that were specifically for the different fraternities and sororities in student housing at the time. So there was a lot of apartment, tenement type buildings, things of that nature. But still, I wouldn't necessarily say they were a high class type of tenement building. They probably your middle class, that were more or less funded by the various universities to house their students. Now, one section here along the Servants Road, uh, this street, and it kind of starts here at Scholars Street, but this road generally, this is a the unofficial servants district, and mostly this was the area that people that served the people in the high district, your maids, your butlers, your chefs, your valets, all of those people didn't live in the high district. Certainly not. I mean, what? You're going to live with the help? No, you're not going to do that. Next, they're going to start thinking they're people. And so they had their own area down here where they could live, and this was convenient because at the end of Servants Road is Doc's Place, and Doc's Place was basically the private dock for the people that lived in the High District. And so if they imported something high end, shrimp or lobster or Erebashian tobacco, for specifically for their household in the High District, then it would come into Doc's Place. And so it was convenient that the servants lived there because they're going to be the ones that are going to unload the ship, and they're going to be the ones that are going to put it on the cart, and they're going to be the ones that are going to bring it to the individual houses in the High District. So it all made a whole lot of sense. Down here, just to to the southeast of the Merchant District, this road here, Yeoman Street, generally is known for the housing of the most of the public, the lower, not the merchants themselves, but their employees and things of that nature. Most of them lived along Yeoman Street, and there are numerous markets and side streets and pubs and inns, and that stretches all along the southern edge of the Merchant District before it kind of goes south on Dockers Street towards the Docks District. So that is the Imperial Port, and we on Tuesday of next week we will be focusing more on each individual district and the areas around them. Of course, starting with the super important Merchant District. So catch us next time on the Lore of Braunhaven.